Hear me?
Yes.
All right.
Yeah, sorry I was almost late.
You're
I
all
didn't realize that I logged into the thing and didn't realize that I had to ask to join. So,
interesting. Got a lot of critters in the background there.
yeah,
Very nice.
yeah, I have my parrot over here, my dog at my feet, and these are all snakes.
Nice. I've got four of them. Four snakes.
What do you have?
Three ball pythons and a California king snake.
Okay.
Yeah, I got a lot of animals myself. Mostly insects and frogs, but got a lot of different things.
We have a vinegaroon and two leopard geckos
Nice.
and a giant hermit crab, three cats, three dogs, the parrot, and I think we're up to 65 snakes.
Wow.
Yeah,
Um,
my my wife wanted to tackle her aphidophobia head on with a tackle.
yeah. All right. So, basically, I figured we would talk about um a couple of things like scientific process related as well as the articles that these people at the Institute for Creation Research were posing as evidence against evolution and apparently evidence for creation. Um, so I sent you the link. I don't know if you got to look at those three articles.
Oh, I probably should have read those three articles. I apologize.
It's all good.
I've been inundated with it, but yeah, you did send them to me, and I should have looked at them.
Let me see if I can screen share on this. Um, the article is if it's the Institute for Creation Research, and they have this these scientific papers destroy evolution. Um, just bring me to the site. Why is this thing? Hang on a sec. Oh, there we go. Now it's loading. Okay, let's see if I can screen share on this. I think I can. Ah, here we go.
Oh yeah, and then we have some guy saying Darwinian evolution is dead, and
Yes.
by dead he means the foundation of modern biology not having any issue at all,
Uh huh. Well, I
except
think
that the believers don't want to believe it.
have. Are you seeing the article right now?
No, I just saw the title,
Oh,
but
there we
if
go.
we're not recording, I'll save my commentary until we are.
All right. I do have a recording going. On Bandicam. Sometimes it glitches out on me, but we can worry about that later. It's still going right now. All right. So I love how they start with no added by the authors. This study is grounded in and strongly supports Darwinian evolution. So we're starting strong there. Um, and then it says this work follows mainstream views of human evolution. We do not propose there's a single Adam or Eve. So right off the bat, I'm just thinking, so why is the Institute for Creation Research saying that this is an article that destroys Darwinian evolution when there is a note at the top added by the authors, one of whom this is Mark Stokely or something, who is in the video, I believe. Um, and what you'll notice is this is a very sneaky article because it reads kind of like a review paper. It looks a lot like a review paper, but it's missing something very crucial in a review paper. It's missing a materials and methods section. When you do a review, you have a materials and methods section basically for saying, okay, I am wondering about this particular thing in science. So my methods are going to be to use whatever database, JSTOR, Web of Science, yada yada. We're going to use these search terms, and if we exclude any results, these are the reasons why we exclude those results from our searches. That way, when people are looking through your particular article, your review paper, they know okay, these people weren't omitting things, they weren't cherry picking studies that confirm what they already believe, blah, blah, blah. And so this is, I believe, an opinion paper instead of a review paper, even though the formatting is very much like a review paper, with the whole, these sections, and they have some citations in the text, and they have all this information. They have figures, this and that. Um, I'm a little concerned about the fact that they only looked at a total of 1,200 moth species, given that there are about 250,000 of them in existence, but that's a different matter. Um,
Well, there is, to be fair, there is the issue of money.
yes.
You know,
Yeah, and obviously, what you will get in the literature on any group of organisms is a strong bias towards the species that affect us the most. So you're going to see agricultural pests, species of medical importance, model organisms. Okay, you're not going to see as many obscure things unless you get somebody who's, really into that specific group and they have some extra time and funding for, some sort of research on it. Um,
so what we have is where, like one creationist might come on and make a video where he's wearing a lab coat. He's never stepped into a lab, probably not since high school, if then, if he went to a public school. But he's going to wear a lab coat so that he looks like a scientist.
mm-hmm.
And then some other guy is going to show up with a fedora and a safari jacket, and he's going to look like a field scientist.
Yes.
That's the whole game, is they just want to look the part because they're doing live action role play.
Yes.
So that's what this paper is. It looks like a peer review paper so that the wanna believers can make believe that it's a peer review paper.
Yes.
And all it does is reinforce what they already believe. I
Yeah.
want to call attention to where they say Darwinian evolution,
Yes.
because I don't understand the purpose of saying Darwinian evolution. If you don't specify, we know that there's a word in colloquial English that, if you say evolution just by itself, that might mean, given the context, it could mean any sort of change over time. And people have used that word when they're talking about, cosmology or something like that. They have used that word. But in general, if you just say evolution, if you say that you're going to talk about evolution and don't specify anything else, we know that you're talking about an aspect of biology, of population genetics.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to specify anything else. We know. So why would you have to say Darwinian evolution? Here's why. Creationists have taken they've done this new pattern where they do a lot of equivocation, where you mix multiple contexts and definitions with deceptive effect. So they often say, for example, that that's not evolution, that's not natural selection, that's not Darwinian evolution, that's adaptation. But if you look up the biological definition of adaptation, it is evolution under the influence of natural selection. That's the definition of what adaptation means. So when they say that that's not Darwinian evolution, what does Darwinian evolution mean? Well, the scientists would think that we are limiting evolution to what, Darwinian mechanisms, for example. We're only talking about natural selection. Maybe we're limiting to a 19th century concept, or maybe we are contrasting Darwinian evolution from Lamarckian evolution as if this was 150 years ago and that distinction still needed to be made. But the way that creationists phrase Darwinian evolutionists, they want to make a distinction between what they call evolution, which is essentially just microevolution, sort of, and then Darwinian evolution is their new word for macroevolution. Because they've gotten pissed off when they found out that micro and macro, neither one means the things that they thought that it did. So creationists used to say, Well, we accept microevolution, of course, but we reject macroevolution. And then they would try to redefine what both terms meant.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out in reality, they actually accept macro and reject micro. And the reason I say that is because when they reject macroevolution, they say they fully accept. They used to argue when I was a kid. They would argue that macroevolution is impossible because nobody's never seen a new species evolve. If Darwin wrote about the origin of species, then we ought to see the origin of new species. How come we ain't never seen that? And then creationists started figuring out that, oh, yeah, we have seen that a bunch. We've seen that so many times and confirmed it so many so many different times in so many different ways that it's now ridiculous to say that new species don't evolve. So now we've got to move the goalposts.
Didn't
So the macroevolution is something beyond speciation. And so now creationists will argue that macroevolution, the distinction for macroevolution, should happen at the genus level or the family level. And Ken Ham even took it up to the level of taxonomic orders, wherever it needs to be, so that they can arbitrarily decide what they want to be related and distinguish it from what they don't want to be related. But they know that that doesn't fit macroevolution. So they come up with different definitions. Microevolution is what they reject too, because the new intelligent design creationists argue that they object to random mutations. They insist that random mutations cannot contribute anything to the genome. Doesn't matter that we have confirmation that yes, in fact, it does.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't matter. And they also object to natural selection, which is another thing that, again, is confirmed. And sometimes some creationists will even describe the natural selection process and say, oh, yeah, this is exactly what happens, but they don't call it natural selection. They want to call it something else. Maybe that's what they call adaptation, because they got to use the wrong words for everything.
Mm-hmm.
But they object to natural selection being adaptive, and they reject or they object to random mutations contributing new information to the genome. So they, in fact, reject micro and accept macro, and then they have to change all the words around. So their word for evolution is whatever degree, whatever uncertain, undefined sort of evolution they can accept, like crossbreeding dog breeds, for example, and distinguish that from what they don't want to accept, which is phylogeny, which is, they're molecules to man, goo to you by way of zoo kind of evolution.
Right.
So that's what they call Darwinian evolution. So they know what Darwinian evolution means to scientists, but they can use this term amongst themselves as a code word for the big bad evolution.
Right. Yeah, and the issue with saying molecules to man is if we're just at the molecule level, that doesn't presuppose life has already, been in existence. Evolution deals with what happened after the first life forms arrived. So, how they got there isn't something that evolution even aims to answer. It only deals with what happened after the origin of life. So, their whole molecules to man thing is really misleading. And it's funny because in this particular video, they didn't use the term kind, they used the term type. Because, like the whole issue with them using the word kind is that they can, be really wishy washy with it. And so I don't know what the purpose of the word type is other than, to catch us off guard. But
they got upset that the Bible defines what a kind is. And the Hebrew word min, in the context of the work, describes whether two organisms can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So that means that's the same as the biological species concept.
Mm-hmm.
But if you've moved what you'll accept to the, if you just decided that you're going to accept the evolution of new species by means of natural selection, as some of these creationists actually do describe, then you're accepting exactly what Darwin wrote. It's in the title of his book, but they don't realize that they've accepted that. So they have to come up with different meanings to get around this. Now, if you want to accept, if you want to say that new species can emerge at the family level, like Kent Hovind said, or at the order level, like Ken Ham said, well, now we're obviously not talking about things that can interbreed and produce viable offspring, much less fertile. There's no way we can get a hybrid out of these things anymore. So they have to come up with other words that are less defined than the already undefined term they had. By implication, we know what min means, what a biblical created kind is. They can interbreed and bring forth. But now that that argument is used against him, well, now we can go with the word type because nobody has any idea what the word type means.
Right.
And now we can be ambiguous. The first moderated debate that I ever had with a creationist, unfortunately, it's no longer available online. It was hosted on some WordPress thing back around 2004 that doesn't exist anymore, but it's a sad thing. But the guy that I was debating with, um, I wanted to open with definitions, just to give a page of definitions so that we don't have to waste time in the debate saying when we say this, this is what we mean. But his entire argument depended on misrepresented words.
Mm-hmm.
So he refused to agree on definitions. He wouldn't do it. He said, let's just let the audience decide what they think these words should mean.
Wow.
Yeah, but in science, we know what these words mean. We're very specific about
Mm-hmm.
what our definitions mean. And creationists prefer not to use any definitions at all because they want it to be completely ambiguous. Why? Because it's all about make believe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Ray Comfort, he has this documentary he did, and he's saying, talking to somebody, and she's talking about bacteria, and it's funny because when he talks about fish, he talks about fish kind, but then he talks about bacteria kind, but fish is, generally, what would fish be considered, like a class, whereas bacteria is an entire phylum. And I'm just thinking, well, that would be like saying, you know, moth kind, which is an order, and then you have, you know, well, some people would say, well, there's the dog kind. Well, that's a family. So, you have the Canidae, but then you have the whole Lepidoptera because it's a moth, or some people would say insect kind, which is a class. And I'm like, okay, so you don't even have an idea of how these biological rankings are working. Why should I trust what you're saying?
Yeah, and they don't want one. They get really upset when they find out that words have definitions.
Mm hmm.
And they try to use words that don't have definitions or that aren't well defined. Like they want to use the word fish and they want to use the word reptile because they know that neither of these words have the taxonomic significance that they want it to.
Right.
So fish is not a taxonomic term at all. That's a colloquial expression, and it doesn't mean anything in taxonomy. Technically, we are all weird monkey fish.
Mm hmm.
But with reptile, that's something that used to have a definition in the 1800s until we started finding all these exceptions.
Mm hmm.
You know, well, how can you say that a snake is a reptile when it doesn't have claws? Or how can you say that a tegu is a reptile when it's partially warm blooded, when it actually has it has a tegu. Some tegus actually have the ability to warm their own blood a little bit. So how can you have a warm blooded reptile?
Mm
They
hmm.
find all these exceptions. And so they realize that the old term of being cold blooded and having scales and having claws and all of this, when there's an exception to every one of those things,
Yeah.
then then it's meaningless. We have to have a definition that is consistent for every member and not just certain ones, without making exceptions for certain ones, without like the old classification Pongo, which was supposed to be all the living apes or all the living African apes was once upon a time, except for humans. And if you're going to say all of them except us, well, that's already a Freudian admission that we are among them, and you're just setting up two boxes to keep them separate.
Mm
There's
hmm.
humans in one box, there's apes in another box, and let's just completely ignore that we have all the same definitive characteristics because we don't want to acknowledge that. So this is the way creationists want to do their classification. And so fish then become a kind, and it doesn't matter how many different kinds of fish there are, because you can have kinds within kinds. which again doesn't make any sense given the implied definition of kinds being able to bring forth.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're going to allow that speciation could happen, and if you're going to allow the evolution of new genera or new families,
Mm-hmm.
why stop there?
And like,
Where's the separation?
and they often go from a very animal centric point of view with their arguments about like fertility and this and that, because animals play by more strict rules about who can crossbreed with who and this and that. And so one of the things that is going to be challenging for them is there are new technologies constantly. So I don't know if you're familiar with embryo rescue and plant breeding.
No.
That is basically, so in a nutshell, plants are a little funny. And I was explaining my friend here in Colorado, actually, she's the president of the Rocky Mountain Begonia Society, and she was trying to breed begonias, right? And she was having a hard time getting the seeds to germinate. And so I was going to try tissue culturing out some of the seeds, but I was like, you know what? I'm going to look at these under a microscope real quick just to make sure that they're viable, because I wasn't going to waste time and resources on inviable seeds, and they're completely empty seeds. Plants can produce fruits that have no seeds in them or seeds that have no embryos in them, because the different steps along the way to produce a fruit in an angiosperm, that's usually hormonally mediated. So the act of the pollen landing on the receptive surface of the flower can actually make a fruit occur. That's how you can get seedless fruits, by applying hormones to plants, and they'll produce fruit that has no seed in it. And so it was one of those situations. Sometimes, if a plant is mated with a plant it's not compatible with, an embryo will start to form inside that seed, but the plant will kill it off before it gets too big. So, embryo rescue, what they do is they cross these two plants, and before the plant kills off that embryo, they excise it from the fruit and they tissue culture it out. So they have these cells that have the genetic mix of the two parent plants, but you haven't allowed that to die yet, and you can get a new plant that way. It's called embryo rescue, and they're using it to try and produce ash that are resistant to the emerald ash borer right now, and they're doing a lot of things. But that really blurs the lines of how these species are different from each other, because with technology we can make crosses between things that are at least viable, if not fertile, that otherwise would not naturally occur. And so we're pushing that envelope constantly. And so this idea of, things that are, and things don't magically over time become the same species usually. So you have like two separate species, maybe in the same genus or in the same family. They're not going to necessarily converge into one, but what do you do when our technology allows us to actually converge them into one again? I mean,
Did you want me to answer that?
yes. I mean, if you can. I mean, it's a very complicated thing.
Yeah, I have to confess that the bias that you mentioned before, where we fixate on animals, as you were talking just now, I had to bear in mind that animals are all that we're concerned about because we are animals, and
Mm-hmm.
so I know next to nothing about it. Yeah, I'm learning what you're telling me for the first time, so I don't have a comment or correction on that.
Right. That's okay. The basically the whole thing is that you know I generally like to say what would happen naturally, because you can make all kinds of plant crosses by saving the pollen in the fridge and waiting for the other species to flower later in the season, and you can do that sort of stuff. That would never happen in nature. um Generally the pollen would be shed from the first species, and by the time the second species is blooming, there's no pollen of the first species available. And that's one of the ways speciation can actually occur, is there are differences in their mating windows. So there are some moths in the genus Calosamia where the three species mate at different times of the day, even though their sex attractant is the same. It's the same chemical to attract a mate. They mate at different times, which is how that genetic barrier gets established. Um, and so the issue is, humans can come and manipulate that, but it's not something that would occur organically. That would be kind of my dividing line. I was
One of
talking.
the issues that I've seen is where creationists want the rules to be hard and fast, universally applicable to all things, and they kind of lose their minds when they explain the variance because plants, as you mentioned, have a different set of rules than sexually reproductive animals. Then we have to bear in mind that not all animals are sexually reproductive. Those that are can have bizarre variance in the type of sexual reproduction that they use. I mean, I was going to do a video once upon a time that I realized would just get blocked immediately because it's talking about the sexual oddities or horrors of some species. I think it's the striped hyena, where the
Yes,
female.
the pseudopenis, and yeah.
Exactly. I mean, and all that they have to do to go through the birthing process, horrific. There's just no way that modern day YouTube would allow that video to stay up. That would just get demonetized or blocked immediately, just for the graphic content. And we're talking about hyenas. We're not even talking about people, but still, it would be too much. The censor bots wouldn't allow any of that. And then when you have asexual reproduction, well, that's another thing. That when you have organisms that can change, animals, vertebrates that can change from sexual to asexual reproduction, and how this counters, like disease control in certain environments where asexual reproduction would normally be more beneficial until there's a disease element added. And now all of this is just natural selection. There's no way an intelligent designer is part of this at all. So the believers just lose their shit.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you start talking about microbes, not just protists, but did I say prokaryotes is what I meant to say, not just prokaryotes, but eukaryote protists also. When you get into horizontal gene transfer, now everything is so muddied we don't have an evolutionary lineage.
Right. Or
At least not an exclusive one. We're so muddied now that the tree of life has become a web,
mm-hmm.
and trying to get anybody to explain that who can't, if they can't understand a tree, then trying to explain a tree that has no trunk, that instead emerges out of a web, just becomes impossible because biology makes its own rules as it goes.
Yeah.
And so different lineages will just change the rules arbitrarily in different subgroups. And now what do we do? And that is, of course, that's the kind of organic change you would expect in an evolutionary situation, but it's not the decrees by the imaginary administrator that they want to make believe.
Yeah, and also there's like you can have gene transfer between things in different domains. Like bacteria can give pieces of their DNA to plants. There's something called agrobacterium transformation where you can make a plant pick up a bacteria gene by infecting it with the bacteria to make it do something that you want it to do. And this is like a widely used technology in agriculture. And so it's not
Help me
just
understand that. Is that how do we compare that to endogenous retroviruses in
um
animals?
so the back
You're saying that the gene is adopted from the bacteria in plants, and it's practically applicable, and it has a function in
yes,
plants. Right? I don't think there's an ERV that has a function in animals.
I doubt it. And I think, the whole point of a retrovirus is just to get your gene code passed along. So the retrovirus just has to put its, you know, DNA or, I mean, I think retroviruses are all DNA viruses, but I could be wrong. But the retrovirus just puts its DNA somewhere in the gene code, and it would behoove the retrovirus to put it in a non-coding portion because if you fuck up one of the proteins of your host, you might kill your host. So if you want to be sneaky, although there is some thought that the non-coding portions of DNA actually benefit because when they change, they can actually mess around with how viruses can insert themselves into it. But that's a whole other matter. But
And then speaking of a whole other matter, this is another one of the aspects that I find is the biggest problem, seemingly, when you're arguing with a wanna believer who wants to reject the science because they want to think that everything has a purpose,
mm-hmm.
right? I mean, I don't know what this fixation with purpose is, but they want everything to be intended.
Yes.
That there's an end goal and that sort of thing. Things that are just not evident anywhere in biology, so they can't understand the concept of emergence. And you just hit on a really good example of that. When you have an infectious virus and the virus kills the host or kills the host too quickly to make it effective when it's transmitting, well then over time, and I try to explain this to my very creationist mother. I try to explain how certain viruses, like the what was it 100 years ago? The was it swine
Spanish
flu? There was
flu.
a Spanish flu, yeah, which started in Kansas.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it wasn't even Spanish, but anyway, propaganda. So we have a flu that starts out that is it's extremely bad. It tended to kill a whole lot of people. What happened to it? It still exists. It's still a bad flu to get, but it's not the killer that it once was, because in a sense, we could say, as evolutionary biologists, we could say that the virus wants to not be so lethal. It wants to procreate, that it wants to spread around, be as reproductive as possible. That's where the win is. But of course, the virus doesn't have any intent.
Right.
And what's driving this? It's that mathematically, as a matter of population mechanics, if the virus is too deadly, the virus ends up killing itself off. Whereas if it's something that you could just you take the day off of work or whatever, take a couple of days off of work, and you can come back fine. Well, now you've infected all of these other people, in the what is it, the incubation period,
Mm-hmm.
and you've spread everywhere, and now these same people can come back next year and add to contribute to your further evolution. So mathematically, it just simply works out that the virus will be less lethal over time.
Yeah.
Has nothing to do with desire, has nothing to do with intent. It has nothing to do with any plan.
Mm-hmm.
But this is an emergent pattern that nonetheless looks like something that was, I call it incidental design.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I can't tell you how many times I've had to I'm part of several like communities of like animal husbandry groups, and the number of people in these groups that don't understand basic biology and population mechanics, blah blah blah. I have people. There's this like I don't raise mantises anymore, but when I did, there's this persistent myth that if you feed a cricket a carrot and then you feed the cricket to the mantis is gonna die. And first of all, just critical thinking skills. Do you think that there are any other things about that cricket that could have killed the mantis if it did, other than the fact that the cricket ate a carrot? Like carrots don't have crickets don't sequester. Well, the species in question doesn't sequester toxins from its food in the first place. A carrot is not, going to defend itself against herbivory in the same way a leaf is going to, for example, because it's a different tissue type. But you know, the we know that there are diseases that crickets can transmit to their predators that are deadly to those predators. That's more likely to be why an insect that eats a cricket dies versus. And I'm not totally dismissing it. There are things that are abjectly poisonous that if you feed an animal and then you feed that animal to another animal, it's going to make it sick. But, this myth got started without any consideration of what other factors could have been involved in that observation. And it was probably not taken by somebody doing a controlled study, this and that, because I've fed crickets after they've eaten carrots to all sorts of creatures, and they've been just fine. Um, and so, like, these are people who rely on anecdotal evidence. These are people who have these really old preconceived notions about things, um, and a lot of these wives' tales, if you will, in a lot of these husbandry communities aren't based in sound biology or scientific method in the first place.
I have to confess something. When I went to college, I remember believing, as I did for throughout my youth, I believed that life was animated by a supernatural spirit kind
Hmm.
of thing. It was what I held to. I didn't know it at the time, but what I held to was very similar to George Stahl's concept of vitalism. That there's an animating life force, that a blend of, let's say, you've got the material plane and then you've got the ethereal spiritual realm, and where these overlap is life. And so the analogy that I would use is like if you have clay, what makes clay malleable is water. So you add water to clay, and now you can move and bend the clay. At this point, it's alive, but at some point, it dries out. The life or the water has left the sculpture. It's now solidified, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. The dust returns to the earth, and the water has evaporated back into the hydrosphere. And I looked at spirituality in much the same way. And I went to college, and I remember taking a biology course for science majors and seeing the production of ATP, seeing how synapses work, seeing it on the molecular level when you talk about these things and how these chains function. I remember thinking that there's no need for an animating spiritual form. Not only is there no need for it, there's no room for it. And while I'm personally embarrassed that I ever held such a belief, ever, I regularly encounter people who still believe that now, even after having taken college courses.
I strongly suspect there's a heavy social component, like social pressure to hold on to certain beliefs, um, that influences a lot of people, without them realizing it. I mean, I don't study psychology, but I strongly suspect that, you know, when you're surrounded with people, like, for example, a lot of time I have a lot of friends and they're not really that religious, but when somebody in their family dies, they'll say something like, "Oh, I know you're up there looking down on me." I'm like, and like it would be socially inappropriate for me to say, "Well, you can't know that. You don't know that." Um, and maybe they don't mean it like they're definitively sure about it when they say it, but they still say it. And whether that's just going through the motions of that's what you do when somebody dies, or they actually believe it, I just don't know.
I remember seeing this meme about how atheists differ when it comes to our pets. Right, so we will be completely callous at somebody's funeral. They're not in a better place now. They're in the earth getting eaten by worms. But then when one of our pets dies, you see one girl turn to another and say, "Mitzi crosses the rainbow bridge."
Yes, that's funny.
Yeah. Um, I mean, I don't. I mean, I had problems even as a child rationalizing the spiritual afterlife. Couldn't make sense of it. The pointlessness of eternity was a big problem for me. I mean, if there's no way in eternity that you can continuously improve. I mean, there's no way you can. I mean, look at it. Look at like video games in the '80s. Where you can conceivably on a single quarter, spend all day in that arcade, but the level you get up to is going to be maddening as far as the complexity and the speed. I mean, how good do you have to be to get there? Yeah, but with eternity, there's only so far you can go, and we're not allowed any progression. We're not allowed to be better at all. We're not allowed to go up levels. We're not allowed to learn more, be more. None of that. When we die, our goal, according to most major religions, is to kiss the ass of an inexplicably insecure despot who can also read your mind, and so you better be thinking nice thoughts all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And you can always be judged posthumously in heaven if you fuck up or break the rules. So I guess I've heard believers tell me that you only have free will on earth, but that you don't have free will anymore in heaven. Like, why? The contrast that you're talking about, why would I want to be, why would anyone want to be in heaven?
Yeah.
There's no point to it. It's abysmal, literally. So I just always had trouble with that. I had a better view of reincarnation than I did with, because I at least liked the idea of being able to start again in a new body, in a new species, perhaps, maybe in a new world, you know. And when I was in my hippie stage as a young man, because I was raised in California in the '70s, so I was very spiritual at that.
Mm-hmm.
I remember finding more appeal in that. And I could do 1,000 different lifetimes in different forms in different worlds and have different types of experiences. It's like playing role playing games with different characters. You sometimes sample all the different characters available. And so that's the way I looked at the spiritual afterlife. The idea of spending eternity in one place at all, forever and ever and ever, uh, deprived of my ability to let it end.
Mm-hmm.
Can't even do that.
See, I.
As Christopher Hitchens said, I mean, at least when you're in North Korea, you can commit suicide and get out of North Korea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I always have this conversation with people, and like it's hard because like sometimes I say things that you're not really supposed to say. I have a really tricky time navigating social situations, but I always find it confusing when somebody who believes in an afterlife gets sad about somebody dying because like shouldn't you like be glad that this person is no longer in pain on earth and they're like living in heaven hopefully in their and free of anything that was weighing them down here on earth, blah blah blah, and apparently you're not. You're like crying your eyes out, and you're unable to function for 3 weeks on in some cases, and it's like, if you truly believed that your loved one was in heaven right now, you wouldn't really have this reaction. So there's something fishy there.
Indeed. So we've spent maybe 40 minutes already talking about this, but we haven't talked much about these three, I guess, or
Yeah,
four
there.
scientific arguments. So let's try to be systematic and get through those.
Yes. Um. All right. So this, I'm having a hard time getting this thing to scroll. What did I just do?
Yeah, and I should have read these in advance. I've just been inundated with other things. That's my excuse anymore for everything. I know other people who do the same thing that I do, and they have time to get good at video games, or they have time to go meet another couple for tennis. And I
Oh
don't
yeah,
have I
I
don't have that kind of time.
I'm
I
planning
just
a
work.
I'm planning a big experiment right now with orchid seeds using insect protein instead of cow protein as a nitrogen source, but that's a different matter. Um, but so this article, let me go back to it.
That sounds fun too.
Yes, I'll give you the whole rundown about it later through email. But the they have this section called the pre-kiss or precis, um, where they talk about the cytochrome oxidase subunit 1 barcodes, began as an aid to animal species identification and made no claims of contributing to evolutionary theory. Um, I don't know if that's entirely true because generally they use these DNA pieces to place things on a taxonomic tree based on their evolutionary relationship with each other. Um, 5 million DNA barcodes later, the consistent and commensurable pattern they present is one of the most general in biology. All right. They aren't really defining general, but what can you do there? Um, and then in well-studied groups, the majority of DNA barcode clusters agree with domain experts' judgment of distinct species. Not entirely sure what they mean by that. Um, And then page 2 here is saying the tight clustering of barcodes and unfilled sequence space are key facts of evolutionary life that evolutionary of animal life that evolutionary theory must explain. Why? Why is the tight clustering of barcodes and unfilled sequence space key facts that evolutionary theory must explain? Evolutionary theory is just about change in genomes over time, or in change in gene pools over time within a population.
Another thing is, and I think it's very important to bring up, when I tell people that evolution is the only scientific explanation or is the scientific explanation of biodiversity, I can specify that it's not just the only scientific explanation. It is, in fact, the only explanation at all. We know how different varieties of bananas were derived. By agricultural means. We know how we derive different breeds of dogs. We know how through artificial selection. We know how there were different species of dogs and cats and cattle and pigeons and so forth. And ducks were all derived by natural selection. So and everybody accepts this. So the most hardcore creationist will still say that God did not create mallards separate from Muscovies, separate from wood ducks, or that God didn't create a Shih Tzu, is separate from a teacup poodle. God did not create all these breeds. We know where they came from, right? He didn't create the African painted dog separate from the Asian raccoon dog, separate from the South American bush dog. These things are all related. Too obvious to dispute. We accept these evolved. But they have to draw a line somewhere, and they can't find a place to draw a line. Where do you separate one from another? Where do you come up with a different notion of kinds? And so this is the quandary that they have. But when they complain that what I'm talking about is only microevolution, which they can't properly define, I say, okay, fine. Show me microcreation.
Yes.
Show me that there's a there. We can show you that evolution happens, that we know that evolution is the one and only explanation, religious or scientific or otherwise, for how we get this level of diversity. And it's implied that this level of diversity, that it doesn't stop, that it continues on. So where is the possibility of the other thing you want to suggest? And of course, there's nothing there. They have a book of stories that make them important, that make them so important that they're the reason the universe exists.
Yeah, and I mean, when I grew up, there were a lot of things that were taught to me that I now know are not true. Like, stupid things like cracking your knuckles causes arthritis, blah, blah, blah. And it's just, for me, I'm like, okay, I held an idea that I know is not true anymore. And like, I don't see an issue with letting go of things that would no longer are true or don't make any sense. And it seems like they so desperately want to hold on to this, idea of creation or even God in general. And it's like, it's not where the evidence leads, but you're so desperate to hold on to it. And I don't know why. I don't get why it's such an important thing.
My dad, when I was a little boy, 7 or 8 years old, and because I'm 61 this week. So when I was a little boy, I'm 7 or 8 years old. I remember when there was news out about the link to cancer from smoking, but that's just according to scientists. And my dad would dismiss them because scientists don't know nothing. They got book smarts, they ain't got no common sense. Yeah, and here I am decades later attending that man on his deathbed as he dies from smoking.
Hmm.
But he's not going to believe a scientist because what do they know?
Right. Um, and there's a lot of medical misinformation out there. There are people who are like, well, certain like processed foods, for example, we're learning are unhealthy, and people are like, oh well, the health consequences are just correlated; they're not caused by it. And I'm like, okay. Part of the thing that you have to understand is that when people do these studies to see how whatever affects you, they factor for other things that it could be. They don't just pull this idea out of their ass and run with it. Like, and I think part of it's a failure on our education systems because, like, we don't get to even practice running experiments until like fifth or sixth grade. And like, I grew up in Connecticut where the education was pretty good. Like Connecticut's educational standards are pretty top notch in the country. I don't know if they're like the best, but they're pretty high. They're not, they're definitely probably in the top 20. But anyway, um, and we didn't get exposed to like the scientific method until probably later than we should have. People need to understand that when you're doing any kind of study, you are being very rigorous. And one of the things I wanted to talk to you about was that, as somebody who's not only reviewed papers from other people as part of the peer review process, but has had 8 papers go through peer review so far, um, there are a lot of things that, you doing the experiment are blind to, and you require somebody else to take a look. And, some of the biggest things are, your methods aren't specific enough, so there are things that are unclear. Your conclusions are a little bit outside the scope of what your experiment was, so you got to dial it back a little. Like maybe you say too much about what it means for the results to be the way they were. I've seen that a few times. Um, making sure you're using the right statistical tests, things like that.
There's an impetus in science not to be wrong. So when you phrase things, you need to be able to say it in such a way that you can predict where other tests will put it, so that your statement will still be correct tomorrow,
Mm-hmm.
or potentially correct tomorrow. And one of the examples I like to bring up is when in the 19th century, when Rudy Virchow had the biogenetic law, and Ernst Haeckel had the law of biogenesis. The same title, very different concepts, but both of them failed for the same reason. They stepped just outside of where their statement would have been correct and would have been regarded as correct today. Where Ernst Haeckel said that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, that could have been a profound evolutionary truth, but for his explanation of it, stepping out of and saying things that are like two key things that were both false, that that completely overturn it and discredit him.
Mm-hmm.
So you lose cred when you say something and it gets proven wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you're religious, there's no peer review. There's no people who will be able to show, and there's no way to correct you in such a way that you would say, you know what, you're right, I need to change what I said here. That doesn't happen. So in science, of course, it does.
Yeah. Uh,
And if I get something wrong in any of the counter apologetics videos that I make, the creationists will always say, well, you're a liar, you just lie. Okay, what I lie about?
mm-hmm.
They can't say, right? There's nothing they can show that I ever got wrong, much less that I got it deceptively wrong. You can't get to step 2 if you can't even get to step 1.
Yeah, and I had a similar thing happen. I admitted I was incorrect about something. Basically, there is an old statistic about the religiosity of sex offenders, and I didn't realize that the statistic was as old as it was, and so I made a video apologizing for getting that wrong, and people were commenting like, "Oh, well, you're stupid," and this and that, and it's like admitting that I'm incorrect about something is not a sign of stupidity. It's a sign that, I didn't just run with this idea. I looked at the original study and I realized this study was back in like 1999. And, the proportion of religious people who were sex offenders was basically the same as the proportion of people in the population who were religious at the time, and that's gone down. So, I can't be quoting the statistic anymore in good faith because it's an outdated statistic. That doesn't make me stupid. That makes me, you know, intelligent, if anything. It makes me willing to correct myself as I go along because I want to present the most accurate information. And that's what I'm driven by. I'm not driven by this need to hold on to a belief or an idea. above all else. And I think that's what distinguishes a lot of people who are not religious from the people who are religious.
That's exactly where I was going to go with this. Where a lot of people who want to debate me, a lot of the believers that want to debate me, think that I'm going to be afraid of them, that I'm going to cower from them because they're going to prove me wrong. And then, oh, what will I do? Well, if you were right, I would want to know that you are right. Because if that means that I'm wrong, then I will have been wrong all the way up until now. And now I can stop being wrong. And now I can proceed correctly. Because I don't want to believe something that's wrong. I want to be right. So I will thank you for showing me where I was wrong and am now right. Now, when I do get something wrong, because we're human, it happens, I don't hear about it from believers. It's when I get something wrong, it's usually something believers overlooked. But scientists will catch.
Mm-hmm.
And oh, will they catch it? And if it's history, historians are even worse. You don't ever get something wrong on history. Historians will come down on you. There are two instances where a historian disagreed with me and basically wrote a book
Wow.
complaining about what I got wrong. It just
Yes.
happened twice. And so they will be extremely hot on it. And so the best thing to do when a historian or a scientist finds an error and they point it out, it's not just a matter of opinion. They can show how I got it wrong. They can show exactly how they know that I got it wrong. And then what can I do? Well, one, I wouldn't defend if I was wrong. I wouldn't defend it. That's stupid. I mean, the best thing you can do for your reputation is to own it immediately, as fast as you can.
Mm-hmm.
So accept correction readily. But of course, religious people can't and won't. No amount of correction. Kent Hovind, for example, made a video last week wherein he accused me of believing that we came from a rock, and stressed again, which is what you believe. Doesn't matter how many times dozens of people have told him nobody believes that. Nobody ever believes. There's not a single professor, there's not a single document that I have written or that I performed. Never anywhere ever have I ever expressed a belief that we came from a rock. Always, only ever have I contested that with sound reasoning. So for him to lie and say that I believe that, and so it's just his word against mine about what I believe?
Yeah.
How is it a correction?
Yes. And I'm looking at this paper here now. Are we still on it? Why on earth? Hang on a sec. I'm a little confused. Oh, I'm looking at the wrong version. That's why. Um, you don't see this here, but I have like 40 tabs open on my browser right now. Um, I have a habit of doing that. But anyway, um, where are we here? So like the one of the things here is like you have this paper and it has this history of COI barcoding, and then you scroll down and exceptions to the rule that each species and well, first of all, like it's always good to point out exceptions, but harping on it is a different matter. I mean, I'm just kind of
This is another thing while you're bringing it up. This is important. We have to talk about this. Um, People have made videos where they pretend to destroy me. But if I didn't even know that you made that video until 6 months later and you didn't make a valid point in it, then how am I destroyed?
yeah,
What 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 happens like in science is if somebody points out something I did wrong or said wrong,
hmm
um, other people, my own associates, my own friends and supporters, patrons, whatever, will come to me and say, "Hey, this guy has a valid point. You should consider that." Just my own friends,
hmm
my own side will tell me there's something you need to evaluate, and either defend your position or concede an error. Okay, I'll do that. Will evaluate it, and if in fact it is an error, as you're saying that it is, then I will definitely concede it, and it has happened.
Yes.
Believers never, no, can't,
Yeah.
not, won't do it.
Yeah, and like, there's a difference, like sometimes I can't remember. Sometimes I'll comment on people's videos, like if they get a minor detail about something wrong, and like, I won't necessarily discredit them for that. Like it's something stupid like, what the sequence of events and like, something that they're not completely familiar with, and I'll correct them just for the sake of them having the right information. But there's a difference between me saying like you were incorrect about this one thing. That means everything you say is incorrect. Like that's not how this sort of thing works.
Yeah.
Like basically I study mostly plant insect interactions. So if it's something that has to do with a plant, if it has something to do with lepidopteran, if it has something to do with how plants respond to being eaten by caterpillars, I'm going to know a lot about it. If we get a little farther away from that, like somebody,
So the birds and the bees in relation to the flowers and the trees.
yeah, like if we talk about ornithology, I may not know as much, and so I'm more likely to make an error from talking about ornithology. And then when we get to things that aren't even in my wheelhouse, like psychology or oncology, blah, 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 anything medical, then yeah, I'm probably going to be more general and make some inaccuracies when I talk about it. And that's why I'm also very careful how much I talk about things I'm not familiar with. But, I always try to keep that in mind when I'm listening to somebody else talk about something. It is fun to nitpick, but also it's not the most helpful thing to do, as I've learned. Um,
There's another thing that I get criticized for by believers, why I won't speak authoritatively outside my field, because my uneducated opinion doesn't matter.
mm-hmm.
You know, it doesn't matter what I believe about Big Bang cosmology, for example. I don't study that. It wouldn't, whatever the explanation is, doesn't have any impact. Doesn't change the fact that we are evolving apes.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about what I know. I don't want to wander off into the weeds on other things as if my belief somehow affects objective reality. Because a lot of these people, I've had debates on this, where they think that whatever I believe about that determines whether there's a God or not. My opinion means fuck all either way.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, and I'm looking here at some of their figures, and what you'll see is there's no method section, so they probably, presumably, didn't produce these figures on their own. Well, they don't cite where these figures are coming from.
oh, you've noticed that other tendency of creationists not to cite sources.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm like,
Because what ends up happening is in all these videos that they make and the debates where they make these claims where they say that they discovered this, or some unnamed they discovered something, or that some study that they've never cited that comes up with this conclusion. If you ever do find the thing they're referencing, you find enough hints in the context of what they're talking about to actually get the paper they're talking about, then when you read it, you discover invariably that it does not say what they said it did.
yes. I suspect that, hang on, let me go to the video. Um, Share this tab instead. You can see in this tab here, here are the studies mentioned. Okay, great. You're telling us which studies on your fucking video you're mentioning. Here's the thing. How many people in
Are
there?
these are any of these three? Look at the first one might be peer reviewed, but the other two, those are news stories.
Yes. And yeah, we'll take a look at those in a moment. But the other thing here is, do you think how many of the 38,000 people who watch this are going to click on these links? Read. I mean, they're not behind paywalls, which I'll give them credit for, because sometimes people will like I've been to 2 graduate schools so far, so I have pretty much good access to any peer-reviewed article I want, because I have an account with the library at University of Rhode Island and Colorado State, and so I can go and access what most articles that I want. a few of the more obscure tissue culture journals from Asia I can't access, which is a little frustrating, but that's a different story. But
I
these
really do wish that science didn't put things behind paywalls.
Oh, I wish that too. Like I have all of the papers I've written saved on my computer, and I'll send them to anybody who wants to read them. I don't give a fuck. If you want to read my paper, sure, go right ahead. But not everybody's like that, and obviously, when a scientist dies, like some people, everybody dies eventually. You don't have that anymore. But this is not this. Where is no, 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 no. Like, this is an opinion article. It's very clearly an opinion piece that's written to kind of mimic a um a fucking review paper. I mean, it looks on the surface like a review paper. I've read plenty of review papers, but um it's not a review paper. It's definitely not a review paper. And the same thing with this one. This is a review paper. This is not a review paper. This is an opinion piece as
Hold on,
well.
give me the date on that. Neo Darwinism
Mutate to
must
survive. Now,
mutate to survive. What year is that?
let's see. Show more.
2022.
Yes,
Neo Darwinism. Do we know what Neo Darwinism is?
I have no clue.
Just for those who don't. In the 19th century, Darwinian mechanisms of natural and sexual selection. That was Darwinism.
Mm-hmm.
When they when they integrated uh, genetics, like Hugo de Vries came up with the idea of mutations, and of course Mendel comes up with genetics, and these were solving Darwin's dilemma because Darwin couldn't figure out how these heritable units of information coming from both the father and the mother, how these were being expressed, and how where new variety was coming from. So when you integrate genetics with Darwinian selection, then you get neo Darwinism or the Mendelo Darwinian synthesis.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's neo Darwinism. So it's basically the 20th century version of evolution. And then when you get into the 21st century, then there's a new revision where it became the extended evolutionary synthesis, and it's no longer Darwinism at all, but they've integrated more mechanisms. Like with neo-Darwinism, they integrated genetic drift, for example. So neo-Darwinism, he's writing an article on neo-Darwinism in present tense, dated 2022. How could I trust anything of this?
Yeah, and I don't want to commit a logical fallacy here, but if you notice, one of these people is from the Cardiovascular Research Center, and the other is a professor of mechanical and aerospace engineering. Okay,
Oh, an engineer. Speaking about biology.
yeah, there's something a little fishy there, and it doesn't
Yep.
it doesn't mean that this guy can't know about evolution biology, but I feel like this was kind of you know, these two people who, one is in Missouri, the other's in Texas. They probably both believe the same thing, and they wrote this piece together because they were desperate to get a piece like that out. Um, and again, this is probably not peer reviewed. There's, an abstract, an introduction, section snippets, which I don't know what that even that like. I don't even know what that means.
So you said you were going to be doing. You've done reviews, and you are effectively now doing a review of these, right? So we're not going to dismiss it just because the decided source was a news article. It's Science Daily rather than a peer-reviewed journal. We're not going to dismiss it just because one's a cardiovascular surgeon and the other one is a fucking engineer, and neither one of them has fuck all to do with the topic. We're not going to dismiss it for any of those reasons. We're going to look at the arguments being made,
Mm-hmm.
the evidence presented, and evaluate that as to whatever that actually implies.
Mm-hmm.
I just want people to understand that we're not going to use any fallacy to dismiss these.
Right.
Do they have any substance in their argument at all?
Right. And like you see here, the benefits of the one paragraph is called the benefits of doubting. There is a difference between a denier and a doubter. Okay, that's not really objective science, that's more philosophy. In science, doubting is mostly good. It calls for more evidence. Sure. Isaac Asimov described as built-in doubter. He encouraged honest probing of new ideas. Okay, great. But what does this have to do? I mean, I know it's an opinion piece, but still, what does this have to do with whether or not neo-Darwinism is a satisfactory theory? Because I think that's what they're trying to say with this article, is that Darwinism or neo-Darwinism or evolution is not satisfactory. And then their next paragraph says any overall mechanistic explanation of the origin and evolution of life. Okay, right there, you have to satisfy two challenges: transition from non life to life and the blossoming of life forms that is so extreme as to appear outrageous. Okay, several problems here. One, evolution doesn't deal with the transition from non life to life. That's not evolution. That's abiogenesis. That's a totally different study.
And
Second,
we can talk about that because I can cite dozens of peer-reviewed experimental studies showing different aspects of the development of life. Creationists will reject that too for a host of different reasons. All of it primarily being that every part of that stands against the Bible, all of it.
mm-hmm. um,
And that's the whole game here. We're trying to preserve favored folklore over fact.
Yes. And then they say the blossoming of life forms that is so extreme as to appear outrageous. What the fuck does that even mean from a scientific perspective? Let me just.
There's no meaning from a scientific perspective.
When I taught.
You read through these, and I'm sorry to say that. I wish I could afford you more time, and I don't have a lot more time.
Okay.
So I'm going to ask you. You read through. I should have, and I apologize that I didn't read these studies, but you did. Is there any substantive claim or evidence presented in any of these three papers?
No.
What's the best they've got, or the closest that they come?
Well, the closest they come is pointing out that there are still things that we don't know. And it's like, okay, yeah, no shit, there are going to be things we don't know. When we learn one thing, we realize there are 30 other things we still don't know. Okay? That's how science progresses.
There was a British comedian, Dara O'Brien, I think his name is, who says, "Well, of course, science doesn't know everything. If it did, it would stop."
Yeah.
And then my refrigerator magnet. There is actually a refrigerator magnet with a cartoon image of me on it, and it says, "Science doesn't know everything. Religion doesn't know anything."
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, and I just think back to like when I would teach like freshman bio students and we would come up with questions and people would be like, so like we were doing an experiment on like sanitizers to kill off bacteria and students would start asking things like, which is the better sanitizer? And I'm like, in science we don't use words like better. We say something along the lines of which disinfectant um reduces the bacterial colony forming units by the most, or something like that, where we're pinning down exactly what we're asking. And you have to train people to do that. But when you use just these descriptors and these adjectives like, the blossoming of life that is so extreme, what do you mean extreme? How do you define an extreme blossoming of life that appears
Well,
outrageous? My version of
every
out.
part of that. What do you mean by blossoming?
Okay, yeah.
How is it extreme?
That
What makes it outrageous? Why are you outraged?
real scientists wouldn't use this kind of language in their paper. These guys should be ashamed of themselves.
That's it. Have you noticed that there's no accountability at all? They can say whatever the hell they want. No one's going to correct them because there's no way to correct them. Other believers can't correct you because then it's just your belief versus their belief. And facts be damned. So we can show all the data to prove that they're wrong as far as hard data and numbers. But they don't care. That's not what they're about.
I strongly suspect that they can get away with it because there are basically almost no scientists in their audience. Because to be a scientist means you follow the evidence and the facts where they lead, and so you wouldn't conclude creationism. So if you're in their audience and you're a scientist, you're not going to be in their audience for very long, unless you're like a scientist in something totally non biological. That's just my take on it. I think that's how they get away with it.
And one of the things that constantly comes up, as you pointed out a few times today, if scientists ever spoke in the terms that believers do, the scientist would immediately lose all credibility. Their reputation would be ruined.
Yeah.
When they step outside of their field of expertise, when they make claims that they can't back up. If you say something is true and you can't show the truth of it, in religion, that's called revealed truth, but everywhere else, and especially in science, that's called lying. And we look down on that. And the big problem that I have with believers is whenever I point this out, I always get some version of the argument, what's wrong with lying? Why can't I? Why does it have to be true before I believe it? Why can't I believe it anyway? Why won't you let me believe what I want to believe? Truth does not matter to these people, and there is no issue with lying. Well, what if I believe it? Well, for one thing, you don't believe it because you're not acting in a way that you actually thought that this was true or that it would matter if it was true. Because I can show you how it's not true, and you're not going to change your mind. You're adhering to the definition of a delusion, where having evidence to the contrary will not have any impact. You're going to cling to that delusion nonetheless. But you don't come to it by reason, and there's no way to reason you out of it. So this is entirely emotional. You've already told me that you choose to believe whatever you want to believe, regardless whether it's true or not. So why are we even talking?
Yeah. Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean,
And this is what I get with believers regularly. What is the problem with lying? They don't see a moral issue with it.
mm-hmm.
And I remember the father of Protestant Christianity, Martin Luther, wrote a similar argument where he says, "What's wrong with lying? If you're going to tell a good, strong lie for the good in the faith of the Catholic Church, or the good of the faith of the Church," he didn't say Catholic, of course, but good in the faith of the Church. God would appreciate such a lie. So I've heard arguments in favor of white lies since I was a child,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't see that.
Right.
I put lies in the same category as violence,
Yeah.
where lies and violence are both something you could resort to as a last desperate act of self-defense, maybe, but that it's not necessary. Neither lies nor violence are necessarily justified even then.
Mm-mm. Yeah.
But
And
other people, it, I've met people who believe what they know is not true and admit that they know that it's not true, but they believe it anyway.
yep. Yeah. I have a friend who like says that she believes in like the afterlife because it helps her cope with people dying, and I'm like, that doesn't make it any true. That doesn't make it true. Just because, just because it's comforting and you whatever.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Alex, I'm sorry that I'm going to have to bail,
All right. Well, this has
but
been fun.
it has been. It has been. Again, I apologize that I didn't read the papers. I really should have. I should have contributed more to your project in rebutting these.
All right. Well, thank you. All right. Very good. Turn that off.